Welcome everyone to BCLA's 6th Annual Healthcare Symposium. We're really excited for today's event. We have such a fantastic lineup of speakers with us today, and I can't wait to get started. If you're unfamiliar with BCLA, we are a project of the 501c3 nonprofit community partners with a mission to inspire, educate, and connect the emerging scientists and entrepreneurs to grow and diversify biotech in LA. In previous years, we've covered topics like the opioid epidemic and pain management, AI in healthcare, cell and gene therapy. But this year, we're going to be discussing mental health care. It's a subject that is really at the root of many societal issues, and yet it's so often neglected. We're over a year into the COVID-19 pandemic, and we find ourselves in the midst of a mental health crisis. According to a report by the CDC, the number of US citizens that are currently suffering from symptoms of anxiety or depression has nearly doubled since the start of the pandemic. And still somehow conversations about mental health are often stigmatized, very quickly dismissed. And perhaps that's because the human brain is still so complex and ill-defined. To this date, we really have no clear understanding of all of the precise mechanisms that are involved to regulate our mood and our behavior. And in consequence, over a third of adults that have been diagnosed with major depression are still largely treatment resistant with standard methods. So today, we really look forward to discussing all the breakthroughs in technology, drug discovery, neuroscience, and psychology, and how they're synergistically sort of advancing our understanding of the human brain and how we think, act, and feel. We're so thrilled to kick off today's event with a fireside chat with Bryan Johnson. Bryan is the founder and CEO of Kernel, which has built 2 next-generation non-invasive interfaces. He was also the founder and CEO of Braintree Venmo, as well as OS Fund, where he invested in the predictable engineering of atoms, molecules, and organisms. Our event tonight will be moderated by the amazing Charlotte Cramer. Charlotte is head of marketing at COA, your gym for mental health, and also author of the #1 best-selling book, The Purpose Myth. She's also a Master's of Science candidate in neuroscience at King's College London. Before we begin, I would just like to thank our event sponsor, Axel Health, as well as our tremendously supportive core sponsors, Magnify at CNSI, the USC Michelson Center, Bridge Institute, and Bioscience LA for making this event possible. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all with us tonight. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much. I am incredibly honored and happy to be here and very excited to speak with Bryan and get him to share his story with you. We had a little catch up last week to get some insight and it was fascinating. So you're really in for a treat speaking with Bryan. So can I pull Bryan up to the stage? Great. Hi, Bryan. How are you doing?
Great. Nice to see you.
Yeah, you too. You too. I had an icebreaker question before we get started, and I'm also very curious for your perspective on this. Do you believe there are aliens?
I think the recent increase in discussion around aliens represents, more importantly, the hunger we currently feel in society for novelty or maybe escape from the harsh realities of what the world is going through. And so I look at more as a representation that it is time for a new adventure for the human race. And aliens are currently the staging ground of contemplation, but there's probably some other things we could aspire to that would produce equally motivating thoughts and explorations.
That's awesome. What an amazing question to start with, because it's immediately got me thinking about how, like you say, we're looking outside for this inspiration, but I feel like what you're doing and what we're going to get to is really diving right into the thing that's closest to us, but we know almost just as little about. So thanks for that little insight. And I'd love to kick off with just hearing a little bit about what is your vision for, is it Kernel or Kernel, as the way Kathy pronounced it?
Both work.
Okay, great. Kernel, what's your vision that's driving the future of Kernel?
I arrived at building brain interfaces after a few years of contemplation. After selling Braintree Venmo, I wondered what the one thing I could do that would create the highest value for the human race to succeed in the future. And I spoke to all the smartest people I could contact. I held several dinners, and I would pose questions such as, imagine we're in the year 2050 and we're feeling pretty good about the world. What did we do in 2017 or 2016 to make that possible? And so I really tried to explore the imagination stack of the world. And one thing that came back consistently was the brain was an absolute blind spot, that it's ironically hidden behind our eyes, that we're focused on everything in front of us. And the thing that became most striking to me was Darwin's observation that a species survives and thrives according to its rate of adaptation. And adaptation is built upon this scaffolding of progress. So if you make a positive step forward and you want to lock that in, you can build on top of the next step and the next step. And so the formal disciplines of society, for example, science and technology and institutions, we've systematically made progress. And so, for example, if you look at the bubonic plague in the 14th century, of how we dealt with that with prayer circles versus how we were able to sequence the genome of COVID-19 and get a vaccine designed within 68 days or something like that. It's a remarkable demonstration of compounded systematic progress. And so if you just survey landscape, humans do a remarkable job engineering progress. One of the only things that that has not entered into the formalized engineering practices of the world is our minds. And if you look at the raw input of what goes into human society on a daily basis, it's our inner thoughts, conscious and subconscious, and that interactions we have with each other is potentially the largest raw input. And so if we could systematically measure, we could quantify that and turn it into numbers, then our minds enter a formal discipline of engineering alongside of science and technology and institutions. And it potentially offers the fastest, most robust path for us to think about leveling up as a species. And talking about this in cold terms, of course, is maybe a bit weird, but just for example, like imagine, Charlotte, if you had asked me a question about aliens and I would have given you a response, and let's say my self-introspection said, oh, I botched that question. I feel embarrassed for myself because I said something really silly. I might spend the rest of our conversation and my brain might try to remind me 150 times that I should be worried about my embarrassing response. And so we have those kinds of things going on all the time, and we've just accepted that as normal. But to me, the interfaces represent really a new possibility for us to imagine our future.
Okay, and so Kernel is going to ensure that in my next conversation or dinner party, as we start to go back to socializing, that I have better data over when my brain is ruining my dinner party by reminding me of those things that I said that I maybe shouldn't have said, but no one else at the table is thinking of.
That's right, they all forgot it. I mean, like if you make a comparison, if you say, imagine we went to a cardiologist and we had an interest in the health of our heart. And the cardiologist asked us, how's your heart, Charlotte? Like, tell me how your heart feels. You'd say, all right, doctor, I'll tell you how it feels, but also, could you please do a blood draw? Could you measure my plaque levels? Could you look at my EKG? Could you do those tests so we have numbers? Mm-hmm. You would think the cardiologist is not trained appropriately if they didn't want to first baseline themselves with numbers. And then with that, you can identify appropriate interventions. If you take a statin, if you change your dietary regime, if you have more exercise. But that's how we approach everything in society, is we first want to measure a given phenomena and then we go after doing it. But mm-hmm. The brain, our mind, is one of the only things we can't measure.
And so what steps is Kernel taking right now to change that, to start measuring it?
The difficulty was that the technologies that we have to measure the brain today, for example, room-sized systems like fMRI and squid-based MEG, they're expensive, they're big, they're difficult to get people through in large volumes. On the cheap, or the lower cost and more accessible side, EEG has been around for a while. So it's just, the quality is just not good enough. I mean, it's been out and about for a few decades, and it's why none of us are wearing the interface now, or that we're not referencing those insights. It just hasn't crossed the threshold. And the question I posed when I started the company was basically, is there technology that can be built that would cross the threshold of having good enough quality and have be cost effective and be accessible? And if that were the case, just like the genome becoming mainstream, if it enters the appropriate, has characteristics, then it becomes market acceptable. And so we set out the first 2 years of the company evaluating every possible path. And so we were an atypical startup from the start, just posing the question, is there anything here? We had no idea. And we ended up discovering 2 technologies, which we determined fit the characteristics. We've built both technologies. They're both up and operational. And now the next stage is, when we acquire brain data, can we do useful things with it?
And what do you hope to be able to do with that brain data?
It's difficult today for anyone to say anything meaningful about a person's brain because we don't have reference ranges. We don't have normograms. And so if a parent takes a child to the doctor and the doctor says your child is in the 75th percentile for height and weight, they can say that because there's a reference range that's been established. There's a sufficient data that's been captured. There's statistical references. The same is true if we get our blood glucose measured. Is that good or bad? Well, we have reference ranges. Same with cholesterol. Same with ACT test scores. Like, we have reference ranges for all these things, and at baselines, N of one and N of many. But that's why we struggle to say useful things about the brain, because we just don't have these broad reference ranges to start with. And so what our technology could do, and to me, this is the most promising, we could actually create baseline reference ranges for basically an unlimited number of cognitive processes. Now, we need to assess, that's a scientific question we want to pursue, but if we could stabilize these things, it would open up basically the engineering of all things. For example, then the technological systems around us, our voice assistants, our email, our visual environment, our friends, the news, politics, economics, all of it can be built. And this is what I'm talking about with the formal scaffolding is, right? So like we all have a general fluency in nutrition. We understand what a calorie is. We understand what cholesterol or fats and proteins, and we modulate our dietary intake according to these things.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. I mean, we're at least aware of them, and then we can decide what we do with it. But we have no reference point with our minds. We make these crude statements like one should meditate. Well, really? And why? And do I trust my subjective experience? So we just work, it's a guesswork about the mind right now. And we don't have that with anything else in our body right now. We really have, the science is pretty good on what I can measure and then what interventions do.
And what do you anticipate once you have that baseline data, the norms of the brain, like those biomarkers of the brain,
right?
What do you anticipate being able to change as a result of that? How will people's lives change as a result of having better baseline data?
I could give you several answers that would probably be familiar to most of us. However, I think the most interesting things will emerge that will surprise us. Like any new technology, once you have access to data, N of one and N of many, and once you can climb the maturity curve for understanding, I don't know why there's any limitation at all. I mean, basically everything we do would take on a new characteristic of needing to be calibrated for your brain and your objectives. And so it's a simple example of like when I buy an appliance, I don't have to go measure my door at my house to see if it will make its way through the door. We've just accepted there's engineering standards that appliances are built for the door sizes we build in society. I don't have to worry about my car if it's going to fit in the lane when I drive on the road. It's just built. Like, we build engineering structures in society. And we've done crude ones with the brain. We've said if a person's blood alcohol level is over this level, then they cannot drive because they imperil the wellness of others. So, and of course, lights like green, yellow, and red in the United States, are based upon a person's reaction time to a certain color, the physics around braking distance. So we've done these crude measurements, but if we could start doing this in a more granular fashion, those same philosophies will be carried through everything. And so it basically would reconstruct everything we do in life.
Have you started applying any of those to yourself using the tool that you already have?
I apply this actually, so no, not a kernel. We're just bringing the technology up. We're doing our first experimentations. Actually, yes, I did one. I experimented in a bring up study this past year. We had one of our prototype devices, and I did it. We weren't necessarily looking for insights. We were just looking to make sure our systems worked and we could do the whole pipeline. But the question was, what was the effect on cognition from sleep? And so we participated in 13 different sessions. We all had a wearable tracker, and the exercises assessed short-term memory, impulse control, a resting state, and decision-making. And interestingly, my impulse control, my ability to be disciplined was tightly correlated with my deep sleep the night before. Now, I generally have this intuition to know that if I sleep well, I do better the next day, but my ability to resist cravings was improved according to the amount of deep sleep I had. And so that was interesting to start quantifying what my levels of self-control would be. And the brain data was uniquely correlated outside of behavioral data. So behavioral data alone didn't explain it. But I would say that the more broadly relevant example I would share would be my diet, which is where my current regimen is. I do a series of tests to acquire over 200 different biomarkers from my body. Everything from basic things like cholesterol and white blood count to inflammation to DNA methylation. And then from that data, it determines what I eat for that next 90 days. And so I never consult my mind. I never put myself in a situation where I'm looking at a menu saying, boy, that brownie sundae might just be the right thing for me at this moment, or whatever the case may be, because I know that my mind is fickle and unreliable, and my mind it can reliably be expected to do things not in my best interest. Mm-hmm. And so it's a way for me to, if I could understand my brain in a similar way, I may make significantly different life decisions, because I know I am my worst own enemy, my worst enemy. And again, these thoughts are on the nose. They're difficult to hear, because it's like, wait a second, you're telling me I'm not going to a restaurant anymore. I'm not going to use a menu anymore. Like, I don't know, like, you are not taking away that freedom. I actually love the fact that I don't have to be in that situation. And so again, this is as I think about this in the future of being human, it's not just what's relevant for Bryan now, but what I really care about is, what does it mean to exist in 100 years from now? And that's the basis of these brain interfaces, create the scaffolding for measurement, which allow for systematic engineering, which allow this possibility for the first time in human history. As a generation, we can look out over our lifetimes and imagine and aspire that we may evolve to entirely novel forms of conscious experience. No generation has ever been able to state that aspiration and keep a straight face. We can. And it is possibly going to become the number one objective we have, and the thing we find most inspiring.
That's phenomenal. I have so many questions that have come up from that. So firstly, do you anticipate being alive in 100 years' time?
In my current dietary regimen, I've done robust statistical analysis based upon my dietary regimen and my biomarkers. And I believe it is something like I have a 92% chance to live to the age of 85 currently.
Okay.
So absent an accident, then the statistics suggest that would be my lifespan. Now, as we learn more in anti-aging and different health protocols, maybe that will extend. But the answer, it really is, I wouldn't rely upon my subjective assessment, whether that be true. I just want the statistics to tell me what would be probable.
Okay. And then I wanted to go back to the sleep study because I found that really interesting. Did you find a correlation, a similar correlation also between REM and total time asleep, or was it just between deep sleep and control? Okay.
You are correct. It was total sleep and deep sleep.
Okay, but not REM sleep.
Not REM. It was actually, yeah, to be specific, it was sleep onset. So how long it took me to go to sleep, total sleep and deep sleep, which had the highest correlation.
Okay. And how were you measuring impulse control?
It was a game where I would see a green leaf on the screen. And if I saw a green leaf, I pressed the space bar as fast as I could. If I saw a red rose, I shouldn't press the space bar. So and so you'd see green, 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 and then, red randomly. So it was my ability to stop myself from pressing the space bar upon seeing the red rose.
Okay. It wasn't like the marshmallow test.
No. Yeah.
Okay. I had one more question that came up for you, but I've forgotten it. And I have seen a question come up in the chat. So I'm going to move to this as I've realized we've just got 8 minutes left with you. I've seen a message, not sure whether a question about free will or one about the distinction between brain and the mind is more appropriate. I'm not sure whether that's a question. Can you interpret that?
I use the brain and the mind interchangeably. There are camps of people who feel very strongly about this question, about the mind being different than the brain. And it's just, I guess, not a conversation I enter. We're trying to quantify neural activity, and we're trying to derive as much insight as possible, but so not what I typically engage in. And then the question on free will, I'm not interested in my opinion on that because I've not studied it. I don't have anything unique to say. And one of the things I aspire to individually is to not speak, not provide an answer when I have no value to offer.
Okay. The person followed up, the question was in reference to the reliance on the brain with regards to dietary choices. I do have to ask you, what's the one thing that is challenging to not let your mind make a decision around and to rely on the quantified, almost prescribed food and dietary intake?
The thing I personally found most surprising about this whole thing is, for 10 years, I've struggled with chronic depression. And, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. It was an absolute brutal existence. And one of the manifestations of my depression was every night I would overeat. I couldn't stop myself from overeating. I would wake up in the morning, I would exercise vigorously. I would eat a perfect breakfast, perfect meaning like it would be portion controlled and it would try to be healthy. I'd try to be good at lunch. I'm making these good approximations on like these rough, healthy categories. I would eat a good dinner, and then 7 o'clock would roll around and this like monster Bryan just would take over. And I was powerless to do anything about it. And I felt so awful about myself because I felt overweight and I felt gross and I had no control. So I didn't respect myself. And so I did this funny thing where I fired myself. It was just Bryan, from the conscious Bryan who occupied me from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. And I just said that Bryan cannot eat food. He has no authority to eat food. And I made that decision and it's changed my life. And so then I started saying, wow, this is really interesting. I actually, like, all the other Bryans got together and were like, hey, Bryan, evening Bryan, you're kind of making us all miserable. Like, stop it. And so that was a turning event for me. And so what's interesting is once I started this systematic process, I probably violated my commitment maybe 50 to 75 times. And I got to a point where it no longer became worth it to me because I would eat and I'd feel so awful about violating what I knew was wrong that now I can't bring myself to violate because it's repulsive to me to do it now, as much as it was to overeat before. And I never, ever thought that I would be in this situation.
Wow, that's phenomenal. And it just makes you wonder, once you do have this baseline brain data and you're able to almost prescribe in the same way you do dietary requirements, different things like we were talking about the other day, all sensory stimulus that comes into your life that then can make your brain function in the optimal way or the way that you want it to. Maybe how much easier that might be to stop scrolling through whatever you're scrolling through, or buying whatever you're buying online.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is for certain, like there's so many versions of me, and so many versions of me are just absolute rascals. Like they just, I don't know. I mean, I feel I have a complicated opinion about myself and the different versions of myself. And so yeah, I find it interesting to explore that maybe I might become a little less unpleasant to myself, just one baby step at a time.
Yeah. But thank you for sharing your story. I really appreciate that. And I, as an individual, I'm sorry to hear that you experienced that for so many years of your life. And I just hope that this inspires people that there's a way out the other side and ways to take control. So thank you for sharing that. I do have a question about how you see this future of humanity with all of this technology and change coming.
If I try to zoom out and make my cleanest, most sober assessment of what is really going on, the first thing that comes to mind is that the cost of manufacturing, of designing, manufacturing, and distributing intelligence is headed towards zero. If you think about how we've done it in the past, people met, they procreated, we raised people, like we are part of that process. We are intelligence. And now that we're able to build tools of intelligence in the computational tools, and we're able to build it of an increased variety over a certain time horizon, the cost of designing, building, and distributing this technology, this intelligence will head towards zero. So if that's the case, what game do we play as intelligent species? Where do our minds go? What are our meaning-making games when that's the case? And to me, it goes really to this big game of goal alignment. And so when I'm talking about Bryan not eating at night, I'm working on goal alignment within myself. I'm saying, hey, there's a different versions of Bryan, morning Bryan, evening Bryan, with friends Bryan. They all have different objectives. And I'm trying to reconcile among my different versions of myself all the time. And I'm always fighting within myself. And so goal alignment is within myself, it's between me and other people. But the future I see of humanity is for us to recognize this macro trend that our key value contributor is not going to be our intelligence. Right? That's not to say we'll be useless, but it's meant to say that how things are today are not going to stay the same. And so therefore it invites us to contemplate, how are we going to evolve? And to me, it's not that we want to maintain alpha status. I think that's a myopic view. I think the question is, what is the negotiation that happens between all forms of intelligence? Humans, machines, the Earth, like climate change is a goal alignment negotiation between humans and planet Earth. And I think that's really where we're going, is it's the cost of intelligence going to zero, and then this goal alignment problem between all intelligent agents. And they don't have to necessarily manifest consciousness, but the way we get there is through first measuring quantifying ourselves and walking towards this engineered scaffolding. But the faster I think we can identify what game we're really playing, the higher our chances of shared success in the future, of thriving in an existence that we really think is wonderful.
Wow. I feel like I should end on that point because it was so powerful, but I can't help but asking you one more question. What do you think that competitive advantage is, or the thing that humans uniquely have that zero cost intelligence doesn't?
I would question whether we need to be unique. I don't know if we need to be alpha. I don't know if we need to be unique. I don't know if we need to have any of these things. I don't accept as a primary assumption that anything we think today is relevant for the future. This is what I'm talking about when we experience ambition typically by looking at an object and saying, I want to do that. We look at the moon and say, hey, let's go to the moon so we can see it. Rarely do we identify a goal that we can't see. And what or point to in words, articulate in words. And what I'm suggesting is the grandest ambition of the human race at this moment is to aspire to conscious experience, conscious existence that is literally beyond our imagination. We don't have words for it. We don't have concepts to articulate it. We have nothing. And so to presume that the rules that govern our consciousness today, for example, alpha and or unique and or whatever, to me, it misses the point that it invites us to let go of what is familiar and secure and venture off into the unknown, which is uncertain. And we are just not good at that. We're actually terrible at that. And so if we can start pointing at things that are aspiring to say, hey, like, for example, my diet of me firing Bryan and overcoming that situation and feeling awful about myself, that to me points to a promising future where I may not be so awful to myself. I may not just be a misery creating machine for myself. I might be more open to letting go of the secure and the familiar, to say, I'll walk into this unknown. But this really pressure tests us because we love to hold on to the familiar and the status quo. And we have this absolute violent reaction to things which we cannot be certain about.
Thank you so much, Bryan. I have absolutely loved speaking with you and hearing your insights. And I'm sure everyone else on this call, oh my gosh, 86 people have also. So yeah, here's to letting go of control and to a future that we have no idea what's in store for us, and being okay with that.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much, Bryan, for being here with us today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you, an absolute honor. And I think this is a great sort of note to end this discussion and move on to our panel, which will be following today. We're also joined today by Ronan Levy, co-founder of Field Trip Health, the global leader in development and delivery of psychedelic therapies. As well on our panel is Dr. Raghu Appasani, a social entrepreneur who's focused on bridging the gap between Western and Eastern practices. He's also the founder and CEO of the Minds Foundation, which is a mental health nonprofit. And our panel will be completed by Dr. Jyoti Mishra, founder of the Neural Engineering and Translation Labs at UCSD. She innovates digital technologies for scalable brain health mapping, monitoring, and precision therapeutics. So Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Okay, I have another icebreaker question, but this one isn't about aliens, although I'm tempted to revert back to that. We might get to it in the end. How are you feeling right now in one word? I'll start with you, Ronan, because you're at the top of my screen.
Overwhelmed by all of what Bryan said. I know it's supposed to be one word, but it's just like, to be quite honest. So very impressed and overwhelmed.
I feel that. The first time we spoke, I was like, whoa, that's wild. I'm going to try and keep it cool in the fireside chat. So I know how you feel. All right, Raghu, I'd love to hear from you.
Nostalgic. Everything Bryan was saying, I actually started searching my hard drive for a couple of final papers I wrote in college around consciousness and the explanatory gap. So it really got me thinking again.
Awesome. Maybe there'll be an interesting conversation there later.
Of course. A long, interesting, never-ending conversation, I think.
I'm sure. And Jyoti?
I would say I'm definitely excited for us sharing similar paths into being curious about the human mind. And if I could add another word, I would say empathetic in that he shared a very deep human experience and normalize the ebbs and flows of human experiences that we have, which is part of our discussion today.
Yeah, appreciate that. So let's kick off by talking about, and I really want to keep this conversational, by the way. I'm not going to go down the line and ask you all the same questions. So please feel free to interject. We can have a conversation about this, have a debate, disagree with each other. I always find that that makes for the best conversations. So I'm going to start by asking you all, why is there so much attention on mental health right now? It's not as if suddenly humans have mental health. We always have. So why is there attention on it right now?
I'm happy to hop in. I mean, I think there's any number of reasons, and it's not obviously a simple answer, but what I keep coming back to when I check in with myself, whether that's my brain or my mind, depending on how you define it, but I separate the two, is that in the quest for knowledge, humanity has lost a connection to meaning. And I think that's resulted in this overwhelming sense of malaise that we're experiencing in a global mental health crisis. I think diet, exercise, lifestyle, digital isolation, all of these things have a huge factor in it. But when I sort of touch deep down, it's like it's that existential quest of why are we here? What are we doing? And without a sense of direction on that, I think, to go back to the expression of the idle hands do the devil's work, I think idle minds, at least on some levels, can do the devil's work as well. That's my personal opinion.
I want to jump off of what you're mentioning, Ronan, because I think I would say on the quest to self-awareness, we have created a larger gap. And because we have lost that, we're trying to come back to what it is. And then there's obviously the practical reasons of even those that have not dealt with the clinical symptoms or signs of mental health and distress have dealt with it in this, at least in the past year, if not longer. And so there is a desire for understanding, why is it that I feel this way? Why is it that I don't have control over something? So there is, I think, both sides to that that we have to think about. And I know all of the panelists here approach that question of self-awareness from a very different angle.
Yeah, I think, it's obviously in the limelight today because of the crises that we're facing. We're coming out of the pandemic, going into the pandemic was hard, being in the pandemic was hard. Now, it's been so long that sometimes people have a hard time, what is going to be the new normal like? And that is hard. It's impacting people's lives. At the same time, Bryan also touched upon this, we are, in a very critical time period for climate change and the existential nature of humanity on Earth. And all of that together creates a big sort of focus on mental health. But your question, is it right now? Do we think about it from sort of a capitalistic focus, which is I think applaudable, that a lot of people feel that we should invest in mental health care and treatments, and I think that's a great opportunity to make advances. But the brain and the mind has been it's something that people have been intrigued for thousands and thousands of years, for whether it's potentially not with this scientific detail, but the idea of what makes us insightful, who we are, why we're here, has been around for a very long time.
And Charlotte, I also just want to add briefly that the definition of mental health has become a lot larger and inclusive.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, in the sense that we used to think about mental health as illness, typically, historically. And it was oftentimes very much just seen in asylums and state hospitals and so forth. And now we're thinking about mental health as inclusive of financial wellness, of physical health, of social connections, of data that Bryan is talking about, and how this all interplays. So we're realizing that mental health is not affected just by neurochemistry or neuroanatomy or a very distinctive medical pathology, but it's actually society and community's responsibility as a whole, and as an intricate web that affects mental health. So our definition has become, or the term mental health has become, a much larger umbrella.
And how has the role of stigma shifted that?
I guess I'll take this to start. So as you mentioned, I run the Minds Foundation, and we started back in 2010, and there was quite a bit of stigma at that time. We started in India, but there's still a lot of stigma that's present globally, whether it's stigma coming from the caregiver, the community, or the actual individual who's on the mental health spectrum. It's played a role in the sense that it's prevented a lot of people from having access, not just to care, but more importantly, access to the actual tools for literacy around mental health and understanding. So the stigma has actually prevented the integration of mental health education into schools and into communities and into society as a whole. Now, as that is changing, we're seeing a lot more, content and integration of the education, which I believe is the way that we change the platform and the way that we change access. So it is changing over time, but there's been a stigma that's also been clouded by depictions of mental illness, whether it be in media. And now the perception of mental health is changing with the same tool, with media and with social media and with films. And you think about, what is that movie, One Fly Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the portrayal of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, then versus a movie like Silver Linings Playbook that shows the empathy and the real lived experience of mental illness. So you see the change in that. So it's not just clinicians or technologists that can change the landscape, but it's actually everyone involved, and has to take an interdisciplinary approach to actually eliminate or decrease that stigma.
Yeah, and I think that shift in stigma or decrease in stigma has potentially also brought about more interest in discovering new pharmacotherapy or pharmacotherapy interventions and other interventions to treat mental illness. And so I'd love to hear from you all, with this kind of shift in stigma, the role of stigma in mental health, what are you most excited about for the treatment of mental health in the future and today?
I can go first. Many things, just stigma, reducing stigma brings more people and towards a greater understanding of their brains and their minds. So say the kinds of tools that the Bryans talk about, or the tools that are conventionally used in neuroscientific research with EEG and with fMRI. And then together, we want to understand not just what's happening to people in labs and the select population that's in the universities, but also in the real world, as they go on living their lives, perhaps potentially at places like where the kinds of clinics that Ronan's going to talk about and he's setting up, and in people's homes, and then using, integrating wearables with that. And ultimately, the goal is that people have greater insight into who they are, who they want to be, and have an empowered experience, and a positively empowered experience that if they need care, they seek that kind of care from a therapist, or if they're able to get that insight from existing technologies, then they can access that without the need for very costly care. But reducing stigma is like the first key for any individual to feel that, yes, this is not something that I need to bury. I need to actually go out and seek help, just as I would if I had a chest ache or a wound in my foot or whatever, So I think that makes it for very exciting times for humanity in general.
Ronan, Jyoti touched on your work, so I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, listen, obviously I'm very biased, but I'm very excited for the potential that psychedelics have for the future of mental health. And it's not just, it's a constant discussion within Field Trip. For me, the excitement is not about treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders. Certainly that's relevant and important. For me, though, it gets into the exciting part is it helps people tap into those existential questions of like, who am I? Why are we here? Because I fundamentally believe, and certainly the people on this panel and Bryan are far more educated than me. So everything I'm saying should be taken with a grain of salt as the viewpoint of a reformed lawyer / entrepreneur. But for me, that's the exciting stuff, right? Really tapping into joy, wonder, why we're here. Like I've got a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I see them run around, and their experience of the world is entirely different. And I've gotten to the point where I realize that it's not just their experience, it's not just their imagination. That is their world. You know, there is no life except a subjective experience. That's all we can ever know. In fact, if you look at the science, you know, the person I work with, Erin, talks about like, when you look at something, the screen I'm looking at right now, it's like there's a photon that flies through the air or whatever medium, hits your eyeball, you know, travels down that optic nerve. You cut into that optic nerve, you look into that optic nerve, there's no picture of a screen there. There's only a piece of electricity, you know, a photon or whatever form of electricity moving. It's your brain that converts that into your subjective experience. So literally, we are making up the entire time every experience that we have. And so if we can tap into giving that meaning and wonder and joy and infusing that with a lot more, then you know, that's what excites me. I think once you get into that, once you help people tap into those fundamental energies, and I know in a scientific context, talking about energies is not usually welcome, but I think once you help people tap into those energies or learn how to tap into those energies when they need them, I think we're going to do wonders for humanity. And you know, I don't think it's competitive. I think it parallels very nicely with a lot of the work that Bryan was doing as well, which is we can understand it on a much more tangible, objective metric, but the purpose from my viewpoint is still the same, which is we're just trying to create more of that, those really wonderful energies that we all know and I think love and probably want more of in our life.
Yeah, just for the people on the call who might not know much about Field Trip and your work, do you want to give a little bit of a background as to what you're doing and what you're working on?
Sure. So within Field Trip, we have two primary operating divisions. We have Field Trip Health and Field Trip Discovery. Field Trip Health is building out the clinical infrastructure to deliver psychedelic therapies. So it should be clear that when we talk about psychedelic therapies, most of the work right now is in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. So using a psychedelic, as our medical director likes to say, to supercharge more conventional approaches to therapy, because when experiencing a psychedelic experience, your ego tends to quiet, the default mode networks tend to settle down, and people are just more open to change and processing. But what we know from the evidence that at least exists right now is where you do it and the preparation you put into it and the therapy that you pair with it actually matters a lot. And so when we looked out and we saw this psychedelic renaissance happening, we realized those places don't exist. You know, you can't do this at scale and reach a lot of people in most psychiatrists' office. You know, they're just not designed to support people being there 4, 6, 8, 10 hours with all of the necessary human resources and all that kind of stuff. So as Field Trip, we're building the spaces to actually deliver psychedelic therapies. Right now, working with ketamine-assisted therapy because we can, by and large, but obviously as psilocybin and MDMA and other molecules get legalized or approved, we'll incorporate those as well. And then on the other side, from a more medical pharmacological perspective, we have Field Trip Discovery, which is building the next generation of psychedelic molecules, because as truly wonderful, I believe, the classic psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin and MDMA are in terms of achieving the objectives that we have. From a clinical administration perspective, they're challenging. They're very long experiences. You're spending probably an entire day in a clinic, and if you have to have a doctor and 1 or 2 therapists and, you know, all the other attendant people and space and stuff, it becomes very expensive and therefore inaccessible. So we're focused with our discovery division on finding molecules that offer a very similar experience, because subjectively and objectively, they're great by and large, but on a shorter time frame. So hopefully we don't affect the efficacy. People still have wonderful experiences, but more people can access it because it's just more cost affordable.
Charlotte, can I make an argument there for a second?
Please.
Ronan, you started off by saying that everyone here is educated and you don't really see how you fit in. I'm going to argue that it's actually people like you who are actually allowing mental health to advance, right? Because it's lived experiences that have actually been, unfortunately, due to stigma, not incorporated into the practice. And many clinicians and scientists sit behind the academic institution, and we don't integrate in with communities. And so that gap is bridging, and it's people like you who we can work with now to actually advance the field. So I just want you know, there's a huge role here, which I hope you're aware of, and that is very much appreciated right now, coming to the title of this whole event.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Really, that does mean a lot.
Another thing I think that's really interesting, Ronan, about you talking about energies maybe not being respected in the academic and scientific field, is that when we do have the tools to properly measure brain activity at a more granular level, then I think those conversations about energy, we will have the biometric data in order to back them up, so that those worlds will be able to better collide and speak the same language. I think that those human experiences you're talking about do have the biometric data behind them. We just haven't found it yet. So I'm so excited to see those two worlds come together. I'll hand back over to Raghu.
Yeah, absolutely. That's that's what's really tickled me every day. It's like, how do you marry the tech from not just what your brain is doing, but also what your body is doing, and what we're putting into the body, how we sleep, and how when we feel like we want to be active, and how we're moving, and all of that together. And like Ronan is saying that we want to have these experiences that psychedelics can provide us, maybe they're about wonderment or novelty again and again, and if we really do understand that experience, could we sustain it longer than that one therapy session? And the right therapy session matters for that to have the impact as long lasting as possible, and beyond that, understanding it would ultimately we want our healthcare to provide solutions that are actually able to alleviate the illness. It's not that, it keeps coming back after, a few sessions are done. So, bringing together the science and what's happening in our communities and the tech together, all of it would, what we're moving towards is more sustained benefit is what's really cool.
I'm going to bring in the explanatory gap now because it's just burning in my mind. But for anyone who's interested that's listening, you can check it out. It's Joseph Levine who first coined it in Materialism and Qualia. And it basically talks about this aspect between conscious mental life and objective physical explanation. And for me, from my own lived experience and the research around the psychedelic space, I think that the psychedelics are the catalyst to help fill that gap, because there's a lot that with technology, I don't necessarily think we're going to be able to say, hey, this is the baseline, but with psychedelics, we can use it as a tool. And speaking from a clinical perspective, as a psychiatrist, we use this DSM book to make diagnoses, which if it was up to me, I would burn, because it's not a great reference or criteria. Bryan was talking about reference ranges of labs. The DSM is basically that, but it doesn't fit. And each person is unique. And can we use tools like different states of consciousness, like comas and vegetative states and locked-in syndrome, and states in different, psychedelic modes, to then create better maps of conscious experience? Yes. But will we ever get to 100% where we can say, here's a reference manual? I really don't think so, because there's a certain, to use the term energy again, that I don't know if we're going to be able to quantify to that degree. But we can get to a point where we can perhaps use the term precision mental health care to some degree, better than we are right now. And Charlotte, this actually brings me to some of the other work that I'm doing through PIM Health, which you might have seen. And the approach we're trying to take through PIM Health is not necessarily to cure or treat clinical diagnoses of things like depression or anxiety, but it's to say, we've used SSRIs, we've used antipsychotics for years. Ketamine was one of the most recent FDA approved things after decades of any other drug. What happened in that period of discovery? But let's just take a step back and look at what is it that actually causes mental distress and the pathology. It's, from one degree, hormones and amino acids, that are not in balance. So why can't we look at that on an individual basis and treat it? And so with PIM, we're trying to take that approach of actually using what's already endogenous to our bodies to help you balance out and feel like your best self, right? But it's not necessarily to treat pathology. It's just to help elevate you.
Mm. And I'm curious, what is the difference between treating a pathology and elevating you?
Well, I'm very interested in this space of, I like to call it subclinical, which is you don't necessarily meet clinical criteria for the DSM, right? So you don't meet major depressive disorder or, generalized anxiety disorder, but you're kind of going about life like, right? Or languish or just blah. And we have the way that Bryan was speaking earlier, it's an aspiration to be at peak performance almost, right? There's individuals like him who want to be at peak performance. And we are trying to take that approach from a mental health perspective of you're not clinically depressed, but you want to just feel better so that you can function better in your relationships and with others and with yourself. Mm-hmm. And so that's what it's about. It's about enhancing mood and enhancing your role in the community and your surroundings.
I think that's awesome, Raghu. Like, I really love that. And it's one of the key debates that we have internally within Field Trip, actually in my previous business as well, which is in the cannabis industry, which is, in part, why do you have to be sick to pursue medicine? Why is that relevant? I'm a big believer in functional medicine and integrative medicine. It's like, certainly allopathic medicine exists to help people go from below baseline, whatever that baseline is, to baseline. Why are we so afraid to go from baseline and above? And, internally, that's where our passion is trying to elevate, right? And you can do that on all levels, don't get me wrong, but the exciting stuff for us, probably because it speaks to me personally and my lived experience, is how do we make people have better lives? Even if you have a great life, there can be so much more depth, so much more texture, so much more color. That's the beauty and excitement of psychedelics in my mind, is it's cross spectrum by and large. Everyone, I think can benefit from it. I take the perspective that to the extent that anybody could benefit from just conventional therapy, and I'd argue that we can, then having supercharged therapy with psychedelics is also equally as potentially beneficial on a society-wide basis, not in just a disease state basis. But regulations and laws and colleges and boards, I make it a lot more complicated than probably it needs to be.
Why do we brush our teeth before we have cavities?
Right.
Why do you think that is, that people resist optimization and seek out medication only in an acute need?
I'm not sure that's actually true. I think people do. In the last, actually over a long time, people have looked at what people calling going from languishing to flourishing, from going from the this continuum of being ill to being well. So well-being itself is a continuum. And that's why things like the DSM don't suffice, because there's a specific cutoff. When you meet that cutoff, you're iller versus you're not ill, and you need meds versus not. But there, even with the enhancement, like for example, if one were to think about, say, I want to increase my attention skills, let me just go take some Ritalin, and even though I may not have ADHD, there's huge ethical issues around that. So and people experiment beyond the pharmaceuticals as well. What peak performance is in terms of the kinds of things I might put into my body, or the kinds of workouts that I might do. So I think peak performance can be sort of seen as sort of just the other end of this continuing spectrum. And just as many people are, seeking care or wanting to seek care for psychiatric illness. And I think reference standards would help with that when you're really ill. But when you're in this continuum that a lot of us are in, it's we all are seeking to be better human beings and, better at the jobs that we do, better at the, the science that we do and so on. But yeah, I don't think that's uncommon. What we need to think about is the ethical issues around that as well. What people should be able to do and what people should think about more.
Yeah, there's also a stigma to it, Charlotte. I think this comes back again, right? I mean, the perception of going to someone labeled as a psychiatrist versus, a trainer at a gym, it's very different. And so a lot of the questions I get too from patients, I work in a county population most of the time and also on the private side, and still the questions are very similar. It's how long will I have to be on a medication? What is it going to do to me? There's a fear of you're putting something in your body. And people have heard horror stories because those are marketed heavily, but there's that fear of, do I really need this? Because, it's not like, oh, I have an infection, I take antibiotics for 10 or 14 days and I'm done, right? There's a lot of unknowns. Unfortunately, a lot of the medication takes time to really take effect, which is tough when you think about what mental health is. It's this conscious and subjective and objective experience of feeling bad. And you're telling me I have to wait, 4 or 5 weeks to feel a little better. And we don't even know if that's the case for, at least a third of people. I mean, that's a very poor sales pitch to somebody. So that's one part of it. And, as Jyoti was mentioning too, there's just a lot of ethics to this. And I would encourage people moving forward to think about it as mental hygiene for yourself. And what is it for you that you do for your own mental hygiene on a daily basis?
What do you do?
Me?
Yeah, for your mental hygiene.
I try to stick to the 3 M's, which is in the morning, which is basically meditation, movement, and mindfulness. And it can be even for a couple of minutes. And the mindfulness part is anything like drinking tea or coffee, but decreasing stimulation around. And that just helps keep me grounded.
Jyoti, what do you do for your mental hygiene?
I play with my kids.
Nice.
Yeah, and run around with them. It's outside, yes.
You know what I'm going to ask now, Ronan.
yeah, I was just giving you the opportunity. I've become much more disciplined, particularly since COVID, and we don't need to talk about anything else specific about that, but I've become much more disciplined. I work out every morning except the weekends. I do intermittent fasting as well. I've become a very big advocate and user of heart math. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but it's a tool. It uses heart rate variability and uses breathing to help get you into a state of coherence. I don't know exactly the definition of coherence, but when it's just a breathing technique. But one of the things I think Raghu touched on that probably is worth parsing out more. Part of the challenge and the stigma around mental health, and I think there's a whole bunch of history and societal reasons for it as well, that probably were relevant at a certain time, 500 years ago. But I may be frozen, so if I'm frozen in picture, I think I'm still on the phone. But one of the big challenges of mental health applications is it's so hard to measure, right? You go to the gym, you see the results, you're getting stronger, you're losing weight, you're getting muscle. It's like, it's easy to make it tangible. With mental health, because there's so few really objective measures around it, it's like this journey that starts and kind of never ends. And I think that's part of the reason that people are so hesitant about it.
You are still frozen, but we can hear you great.
I'm trying to reboot. I'll be back shortly.
It's okay. It's a great look.
I'm sure it is.
I'm curious to hear, as we've got 5 more minutes to chat, and then I'll bring up some questions from the audience. What are you most concerned about right now for the future of mental health?
Personally, I think, like I said, the emphasis should really be towards, what we've been talking about, sustained mental health care that is sustained care that helps bring insight to people that is empowers them in a lifelong way, that even if, there are new tools being developed, some of them are costly because of the amount of time it has taken to get them out to people, and you have to account for the costs and so on. I mean, the tools, we are going to bring in a lot of new tools. We have to constantly ask the question, are we really doing this to make people's lives better, to empower the patient, but not to make them addicted to the kind of therapy that we're going to be providing. So having that right motive for everyone that's advancing mental health care, and asking that sort of every day is important.
Great.
From my perspective, and again, maybe this is just my philosophy shining through, but I think one of the big challenges with healthcare overall, and certainly mental health care, is this paternalistic notion that doctor or therapist knows best, which at its very core diminishes the agency of the individual being treated. And so I think you're starting already from a step down when that's the attitude, and particularly with psychedelics and the stigma associated with them. I think there's going to be a lot of that. And so one of my hopes and ambitions with Field Trip is to change that dialogue. Let's stop talking about people as being patients. Like, you're not a patient, you're a person, right? We'll talk to you as a person. We'll talk to you where we provide advice, but we can't tell you what to do, because ultimately this is your journey and this is your path and this is your growth, and we'll be there to assist you along the way. But let's not, especially as it pertains to mental health and our subjective experience, let's not pretend like we actually know what each individual person needs. And so to the extent that continues to permeate, I have concerns about the long-term, the advances that we're making, because I think, like I said, we're starting from a step down, and I think it's a fundamental step that we have to make.
Okay. I really love this question, Charlotte. I'm glad you posed it, because the conversation on mental health has been tremendous in the past few years, and no one has actually asked this question that I've been on panels. And I have two answers to this. One of the fears I have is that the conversation of mental health is increasing, but it's increasing on topics like depression, wellness, anxiety, and stress. But I fear that people will forget what mental health includes, and that also includes addiction and schizophrenia and bipolar and psychosis and severe mental illness. And that gap is growing larger, and we're not actually creating accessible resources for people who are on that severe side of the spectrum. And that is one of my biggest fears right now, because a lot of the mental health conversation is being moved by social media, and it's creating that gap to be larger. So that's one point. And so if anyone takes anything away, it's to understand that it is a large spectrum that includes all of these states of mind.
That's such a good point. I just want to touch on that, because I also think that it's been great to see the amount of VC investment go into mental health startups, but they are oftentimes requiring the scale. And if you're scaling to a large group that obviously at that scale, you don't have diagnosable disorders or any DSM criteria met, then you're invariably going to end up with more investment potentially channeled into companies that are targeting the worried well, as they call them, or people who are optimizing, rather than, like you say, people with mental illness.
And I love that we are investing in the space, but the problem is that my patient with schizophrenia and meth addiction on Skid Row in Los Angeles is not going to have a smartphone to open up an app. So we got to invest at that level as well. So that's my argument with that. And I think secondly, Field Trip is doing this very well, but I've seen a lot of people get into the psychedelic space without really understanding that, yes, the benefits really outweigh a lot of risks, but there are risks. And it takes collaboration with scientists and clinicians to work together to ensure things are delivered in a safe and meaningful way, and getting to Jyoti's point as well, that people don't come to it as the solution, but to understand that it's a catalyst on your journey to self-awareness and to healing. And it's not just a one-stop shop. So those are my 2 cents on that question.
Thank you. Okay,
Rita.
I'll go for it, Ronan, while I choose the question that we're going to go to.
I was just saying, I 100% agree with your comments, Raghu. Like, I think that those are both very important points, and I'm certainly guilty. My lens has always been on like the worried well and not severe depression. And recently we're having a conversation internally about the distinction between, emotional health and mental health. And one distinction that I thought was useful, because it's really hard, was mental health really speaks to one's grip on objective reality, and emotional health speaks to emotional resilience and your ability to respond to life's circumstances. And I thought that was, at least for me, a constructive delineation, but I'd be curious to know if you see it from a different perspective.
I see it as basically we all have mental health. It's a spectrum, and we are at different points on that spectrum at different points in our life. And regardless of where we are, there are things we can do to help ourselves. And you're basically, what you're saying is actually fluctuating on that spectrum at different time points, is how I'm seeing it. They're not distinctive things. It's all on the same timeline.
They are. It's just, for me, I was thinking about how do we create a dialect around it where, because when people talk about mental health, most people are going to think about like depression and anxiety and those things that, are very commonplace and typically not very severe. I don't want to diminish it, but it's very different than someone who's having intense bipolar or schizophrenic episodes, right? And maybe the delineation should be mental health versus mental illness, but I'm kind of delineating just to create a dialogue, so people can be like, oh, this is what we're talking about here, or this is what we're talking about here, so we don't get into mushing it into the same category and only focusing on one end of the spectrum, which is, I think, the concern you were flagging.
Yeah, and this is actually what brings me back to the first question Charlie even posed, which is basically like, what is mental health and how it's become this umbrella term now that includes so many different things. So again, I'm going to argue that the most impactful investment that we can make is actually integrating mental health education from day one of someone's educational career, whether it's preschool or kindergarten. And that's going to have the most long-term impact over generations, because then they'll understand all of those terms and what it means.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, I think education is really key. That really brings me back to some of the work we do with children who've had neglected childhoods, and when we teach such children about the plasticity of the brain, we've been talking about creating reference standards, but if you see a brain that actually you can have half a brain missing, but you wouldn't be able to tell from how a person really is talks to you in a conversation that half a brain is missing, because that half that does exist has undergone such incredible plasticity and overcome so much that they can do everything that two hemispheres of the brain together can do otherwise. And so this education also is again not just philosophical, but then scientific. The scientific breakthroughs that have come in neuroscience and psychology together in the past a few decades can together help to educate people that it is within you to find the insights and or seek care. And then the last thing I'd mention is that, they really, what I like most is what, say, Ronan's saying, or Raghu's saying about the idea of treating each one as their own. And this idea of precision medicine is for mental health is all of these wearables or other technologies, and that we've talked about since Bryan was here, what they're leading towards is this N of one understanding. It's like, what do you need? And right now we are doing that with the therapists, such as what Field Trip is training, and psychiatrists, such as what Raghu is becoming to be. But ultimately, all of these people will also be benefited by the tools. These providers will be benefited by tools that that science and measurements can provide, and move towards treating each person as their own and serving their needs.
Thank you for that. Okay, I've got some questions from the audience. I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but we'll try do a rapid fire response. So first question is, what suggestions would you offer in working with potential patients that are stigma stricken? I think Raghu, you might be.
Okay.
I
was going to have the lawyer talk about that one, but okay. So no, this is a really great question. I would say the simple answer is just show real empathy and compassion. And the fact is that if the person has shown up for help, there's a reason, and just ask them. Just keep it open, very, very open-ended about what brings them in, what their perception of mental health is, what they expected from the appointment, whatever it is. If you're talking about steps before that, on if someone has such stigma and you're trying to get them care, everyone can be a mental health advocate. Your role is not necessarily to provide care, it's to link someone to care. So just be present with them and listen, and active listening, and understanding what their hesitations and obstacles are, and just linking them up and being there along the way as a source of support. So, I think that's the simple answer to it is I see a lot of people like this come into our clinic. They're coming from lower socioeconomic groups or don't have a really great sense of what the mental health system is, and they've had bad experiences. And so a lot of it is just having them talk and tell their story and not using a script for diagnosis.
I love that.
I wonder if any of my supervisors are watching this, because that might be
Okay, next question. I think this is definitely for Ronan. The potential of psychedelic drugs in treatment has been realized for a long time with, for example, Professor Leary, but political and social restrictions have prevented this potential to be realized. How can this major restriction be overcome?
I think it's being overcome right now. I always quote it to Rick Doblin, even though he pushes it on someone else. He says, the most important thing we can do right now is not fuck it up, to use those words exactly, right? Which is, the evidence is there, the social trends are there, the awareness is there. It's coming. We live in a world where cannabis has been legalized in so many jurisdictions, and wonder behold, the sky has not fallen. Everything works just fine by and large, or even better than it did before. Mental health has gone mainstream. The evidence coming out of the institutions, not to suggest that Harvard in the 60s was a bad institution by any stretch, but it's just reached a new level of credibility. And I think we've had 50, 60 years to kind of wrap our heads around it. So as long as people don't get silly with this, and we continue to do it in a structured way, which is really focused on psychedelic assisted therapies in a controlled environment, I think we just got to let the data speak for itself. And it's coming so fast and furious, and so many institutions are getting on board, and there's so much social zeitgeist around it. It's just almost, let's get out of the way and let nature take its course a little bit.
Great. And where would one seek information on the relationship between mental health and the microbiome?
We actually call it the psychobiome. There's our gut has a mind that actually does rule us, right? I think Bryan did touch on that near the end. There's all sorts of disorders related to that, but also this is a basic part of survival. But yes, it's just as it's just as we're looking at within brain connections, we're always if one is interested, the science of how the microbiome connects with what the brain is doing, that is coming forward much more. The trouble is that right now the microbiome itself, there's so much ongoing. There's just the kinds of gut microbiomes that could be possible, and people are still identifying those, and then they cluster into so yes, there is a highly vegetarian type that is good for longer well-being, and then there's the highly meat-eating type, which actually is not so great for well-being. But then how does that interact on a daily basis with what's happening in the brains? You have to get that exact biomarker that you'll measure from time point to time point. But when there are thousands of microbiome biomarkers and thousands of brain biomarkers, then guess what? You actually need 1 million individuals to answer that question to get the right statistics. But yeah, I think that's coming too. There's some nationwide studies that have started on this, and I think that science is definitely very fascinating and developing.
Yeah,
I would recommend for anyone who's interested in that, Dr. Drew Ramsey actually does quite a bit of work around this, and he's very accessible and communicates this information quite well. So I would check him out as well. And when you think about the microbiome, to not only think about the gut microbiome, but also the microbiome of the environment, how that impacts their mental health too.
So interesting. Okay, I'm going to wrap up now, but as I promised, one last question. Yes or no, are there aliens?
Yes.
Great. I'm pointing as if you know who I'm pointing to. Sorry. I was pointing to Jyoti. I'm not pointing to the aliens.
I'll say maybe. I've always believed in ET as a maybe, my childhood fantasy.
I mean,
I think
none of you know if I'm human or alien, so I would say yes.
When I was at university in undergrad, I actually took a course called Life on Other Worlds, if you can believe it. That was it's one of the hardest courses I took actually in undergrad at University of Toronto. But I thought the professor did a great job. He said, if I answered in a word, yes. In 2 words, yes, maybe. In 3 words, yes, or 5 words, yes, maybe, given certain assumptions, right? And that's the real answer. But if I had 1 word, I started with yes.
I love that. If I'm not sure, then I think, what world do I want to live in? A world with aliens or a world without? And then I just pick the one that I want to live in, because as you say, our decisions are our reality. So I live in a world with aliens.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you all so much.
Adventurous. Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Charlotte, for the fantastic, insightful questions and the great moderation. Thank you to Bryan, Ronan, Raghu, and Jyoti for taking the time to be here with us today, for all the insights that you've provided us with, and sort of this outlook as to what is to come in the future. Thank you also to our events lead, Justin Overhulst, for helping me curate this event, and the entire BCLA team for your help in organizing and promoting. Thank you to our sponsors again, and thank you to all of our attendees for being here today. I hope that this was a helpful discussion for everyone.
Charlotte, to answer your very first question, my current state is now excited and energized.
Awesome.
Full circle.
Ronan and Jyoti, pleasure meeting both of you on here, and looking forward to chatting more.
Likewise. Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.
Likewise. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Have a good evening.